The camera descends, stone stairs. Torchlight flickers against walls that predate most nations on earth. Beneath the grandeur of St. Peter's Basilica, beneath the marble and the incense and the pilgrims' prayers, there is another Rome. A Rome of ledgers, of compound interest, of credit lines extended across continents. The Vatican is the oldest continuously operating financial institution in the Western world. Not a metaphor. A fact. While the Medici Bank collapsed in 1494 and the Knights Templar were burned by a French king who owed them too much money, the Church kept its accounts open, kept its coffers filling, kept its creditors at bay, and its debtors on their knees, sometimes literally. This is not a story about faith. This is a story about money, survival, and the architecture of institutional power. How does an organization with no army, no territory it can truly defend, and a spiritual mandate survive the fall of Rome, the Protestant Reformation, Napoleon's invasion, 2 world wars, and a banking scandal that reached all the way to a body found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge in London? The answer is the same answer it has always been. Follow the money. Before there was a Vatican Bank, there was Constantine. The year is 313 CE. The Edict of Milan has just made Christianity legal across the Roman Empire. And with legality came legitimacy. And with legitimacy came land grants. Enormous ones. Constantine didn't just tolerate the church. He funded it. He gifted estates across Italy, North Africa, and the eastern provinces. He built basilicas at imperial expense. He exempted clergy from taxation. In a single generation, the Roman Catholic Church went from a persecuted underground movement to the largest landowner in the Mediterranean world. This is capital formation at a scale that would not be repeated until the Dutch East India Company 15 centuries later. And capital, once formed, generates its own imperatives. It must be managed, protected, grown. The bishops of Rome, not yet called popes, not yet wielding the full weight of the title, needed administrators, accountants, men who could track rents across 1,000 farms, manage donations in coin and kind, negotiate with merchants and nobles and emperors. The Church did not intend to build a financial system. It built one because it had to. By the 5th century, the Roman Empire in the West had collapsed. The Church had not. It had, in fact, absorbed much of what the empire left behind. Its administrative networks, its legal frameworks, its educated class. The bishops inherited the machinery of Rome and turned it, piece by piece, toward the management of what historians would later call the Patrimonium Petri, the patrimony of Peter, the original endowment, the First Vatican portfolio. What made this inheritance so durable was not piety. It was paperwork. The Church had something almost no other institution of the early medieval world possessed: a literate administrative class capable of writing contracts, recording transactions, and enforcing agreements across generations. Abbots died, bishops were replaced, the documents remained. The claims they encoded outlasted the men who made them. This is the foundation of institutional wealth, not gold in a vault, but the legal architecture that says the gold belongs to you, and has said so for 200 years. Here is a problem the medieval Church faced that its theologians spent considerable energy trying not to think about. Usury is a sin. Charging interest on a loan is, by scriptural definition, an act of moral corruption. And yet the Church needed loans, needed to pay armies, fund construction, reward allies, and punish enemies. The tension between doctrinal purity and institutional necessity produced some of history's most creative financial engineering. Enter the Templars. Founded in 1119, ostensibly to protect pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem, the Knights Templar became within 2 generations the first international banking network in European history. A crusader in France could deposit gold with a Templar preceptory, receive a coded letter of credit, travel to Jerusalem, and withdraw the equivalent sum from a Templar treasury there. No gold transported. No robbery risk. Pure information arbitrage. 7 centuries before wire transfers. The church didn't invent this system, but it blessed it, and it learned from it. The concept of the letter of credit, the idea that value could be transmitted through trusted institutional channels without the physical movement of coin, became foundational to papal finance. Meanwhile, a parallel innovation was emerging in the monasteries. The Cistercian order, founded in 1098 inches, a spirit of radical poverty, became by the 12th century one of the largest agricultural enterprises in Europe. Their network of granges farming estates managed with military efficiency generated surpluses that were systematically reinvested. They were not supposed to be businessmen. They became some of the best in the world. The church's relationship with money was never simple. It condemned the moneylender while running the most sophisticated credit networks on the continent. It preached poverty while accumulating assets that would make modern hedge fund managers envious. This contradiction is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. And it is worth pausing here to understand why the contradiction persisted rather than resolving itself. The church could not simply abandon its theology to match its practice. The theology was the source of its authority. Its authority was the source of its wealth. Remove the spiritual mandate, and you remove the justification for the tithe, the bequest, the donation, the fee. The church needed to believe, or at least to perform believing, that it stood outside the ordinary logic of money, precisely because that belief was its most valuable financial asset. Let us be precise. By the high medieval period, the church had developed at least 6 distinct revenue streams, each with its own administrative infrastructure and political logic. First, land rents. The church's agricultural estates across Europe generated consistent income that was, in a pre-capitalist economy, the most reliable form of wealth. The Pope was, among other things, one of the largest landlords in the known world. Second, tithes. The mandatory 10% tax on agricultural income, enforced by canon law and backed by the threat of excommunication, represented a taxation system covering a population of hundreds of millions. The collection infrastructure required to manage this diocese, parishes, cathedral chapters was, itself, a financial organization of extraordinary complexity. Third, fees for spiritual services. This is where the church's critics found their most powerful ammunition. Indulgences annates the first year's revenue from a church appointment, paid to Rome, fees for dispensations, fees for papal bulls, fees for the resolution of ecclesiastical court cases. The church monetized nearly every junction between the sacred and the administrative. By the 15th century, the papal curia had become, in the words of one contemporary critic, less a house of God than a counting house. Fourth, crusade revenues. Special levies imposed on European Christendom to fund military campaigns in the Holy Land generated enormous one-time capital infusions. When those campaigns failed, which they frequently did, the money remained in ecclesiastical hands. Fifth, bequests and donations. The dying rich of medieval Europe gave extravagantly to the church in exchange for masses said in their name, burial in consecrated ground, and the comfort of institutional prayers for their souls. The church received their assets. They received, in theory, a faster transit through purgatory. Sixth, the financial markets. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the papacy was borrowing from and lending to the great banking families of Florence, Siena, and Lucca, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Alberti. The church was both a customer and a counterparty in the emerging credit markets of late medieval Europe. These 6 streams did not operate independently. They reinforced each other. Land generated rents that funded administration. Administration enabled the collection of tithes. Tithes created surplus capital that could be lent to kings. Kings who borrowed from the church owed it political favors. Political favors protected the land. The system was not designed. It evolved. And like all evolved systems, it was extraordinarily difficult to dismantle, because every part of it depended on every other part. Power concentrations of this magnitude do not remain clean. They produce men who game them. The sale of indulgences, the practice of purchasing a formal document remitting the temporal punishment due to sin, had existed in various forms since the 11th century. By the early 16th century, it had become an overt revenue generation operation. Johann Tetzel, the Dominican friar sent to Germany to raise funds for the construction of St. Peter's Basilica, reportedly sold indulgences with the slogan, "As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs." Whether he actually said it is disputed. That it captured the spirit of the operation is not. Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg in 1517. The Protestant Reformation was, among other things, a revolt against the church's financial practices. The theological objections were real and profound, but they were inseparable from economic ones. The northern European countries that broke from Rome were also, not coincidentally, freeing themselves from the flow of tithe revenue southward to Rome. The church lost roughly half of Europe. It lost enormous revenue streams. It lost the credibility of its financial operations. What it did not lose was the institution itself. The Counter-Reformation response, from the Council of Trent onward, was partly theological and partly administrative. It reformed, or at least reformed, the optics of the most egregious revenue practices. It centralized financial control more tightly in Rome. It created new religious orders, most notably the Jesuits, that functioned, among other things, as the Church's most sophisticated network of political and economic intelligence gatherers. The Church had survived the Reformation not by being pure, but by being adaptable. It had learned that institutional survival requires the ability to reform enough to continue, without reforming so much that the institution dissolves. It is a lesson that would be tested again and again. 2 centuries later, Napoleon invaded the Papal States. He imprisoned Pope Pius VI, who died in French captivity. He stripped the Vatican of art, assets, and territory. By every conventional measure of institutional vulnerability, the Church should have collapsed or been permanently subordinated to French imperial authority. It was not. Within 15 years of Napoleon's final defeat, the papacy had recovered its temporal holdings, rebuilt its administrative networks, and reasserted its spiritual authority across Catholic Europe. The balance sheet had been devastated. The institution had not. The 18th of June, 1982, London. A man named Roberto Calvi is found hanging from scaffolding beneath Blackfriars Bridge, his pockets stuffed with bricks and cash. He is the chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, Italy's largest private bank, and the primary correspondent bank for the Vatican's own financial institution, the Istituto per le Opere di Religione, known by its initials IOR, the Vatican Bank. The IOR was founded in 1942 by Pope Pius XII. Ostensibly created to manage assets for religious works, it operated with a feature no other bank in the world possessed. It was located within a sovereign state, Vatican City, but was not subject to the banking regulations of any other country. No anti-money laundering oversight, no deposit reporting requirements, no external audit. It was, in the technical language of finance, an offshore jurisdiction inside the walls of Rome. The Calvi affair was not an aberration. It was the visible edge of a network that connected the IOR to the Banco Ambrosiano, to the Sicilian Mafia, to the shadowy Masonic lodge known as Propaganda Due, to the recycling of funds for anti-communist political operations in South America and Poland. The CIA, the Mafia, the Vatican, and Polish Solidarity connected through the ledger books of an institution that answered to no earthly regulator. Banco Ambrosiano collapsed in 1982, with a hole of approximately $1.3 billion in its accounts. The IOR acknowledged moral involvement, a term carefully chosen by lawyers to admit nothing legally, while acknowledging everything practically, and paid $250 million to creditors. No Vatican official was charged with a crime. No church assets were seized. The institution survived. Again, Pope John Paul II commissioned an external review. His successor, Benedict XVI, was reportedly removed, The circumstances remain contested, partly over his inability to reform the IOR. Francis, elected in 2013, launched the most serious financial reform effort in the Church's modern history. In 2013, Pope Francis said something that no pope had said in precisely this way before. The Church's financial operations were, in his word, corrupt, not misguided, not in need of improvement. Corrupt. He appointed a commission staffed not with Vatican insiders but with lay financial professionals from the outside world. He brought in Cardinal George Pell, the Australian archbishop who had built a reputation as a financial disciplinarian, to lead the new Secretariat for the Economy. He pushed for the IOR to register with Moneyval, the Council of Europe's anti-money laundering watchdog. The results were partial. The IOR closed thousands of accounts, primarily accounts held by entities that should not, under any credible reading, have been banking with a religious institution. Accounts held by Italian politicians, by shell companies, by individuals with no demonstrable connection to religious works. The number of accounts fell from approximately 19,000 to under 5,000 between 2012 and 2016. Was it enough? The question is genuinely contested. Reformers inside and outside the Vatican argue that the institutional culture, the opacity, the preference for informal networks over formal accountability, the deep conviction that the Church's operations are nobody else's business, resists change at the structural level. The ledgers can be cleaned. The habits of secrecy are harder to audit. Cardinal Pell, the man Francis chose to lead the reform, was later convicted of historical sexual abuse in Australia, then acquitted on appeal. The intersection of institutional scandal, personal culpability, and reformist mandate is, in the Vatican as everywhere, impossibly tangled. Francis himself has been accused by conservative critics of using financial reform as a political tool, a way of centralizing power and removing institutional opponents under the guise of cleaning the books. Whether that accusation is accurate or is itself a defensive maneuver by those who benefit from opacity is, like most questions about Vatican finance, genuinely difficult to answer from the outside. What is not difficult to answer is this. The reform process revealed the scale of what had been hidden. The 14,000 accounts that were closed were not empty. They contained real assets, managed by real people, for purposes that bore no relationship to the institution's stated mission. For decades, the most secretive bank in the world had been operating in plain sight, inside the most photographed building on the planet. Here is what the Vatican's financial history actually teaches, stripped of both reverence and cynicism. Every large institution that survives long enough faces the same fundamental problem. The mechanisms built to serve its mission eventually develop their own interests. The Church built financial systems to pursue spiritual ends. Those systems, once built, pursued their own continuation. The institution that managed them survived, not because it was good or pure or always right, but because it was resilient, capable of adaptation, capable of scandal, capable of reform, just sufficient to continue. This is not a Catholic story. It is an institutional story. Every organization that has survived for centuries has learned the same lesson in different forms. The balance sheet and the mission statement are two different documents, and the people who manage them are often working at cross purposes. The Medici fell, the Templars fell, the Hanseatic League fell, the East India Company fell. The Vatican is still open for business. Is that a success story? That depends entirely on what you think the institution is for. What we can say with precision is this. The Vatican Bank holds assets estimated at between $4 and $8 billion, depending on the methodology used and the year of estimation. It manages the financial interests of an organization operating in 135 countries. It has survived currency collapses, world wars, the loss of the papal states, a mafia entanglement, and the most comprehensive internal audit in its modern history. The oldest trick in the history of institutional power is not deception. It is continuity. The ability to still be here, still keeping accounts, still compounding interest, while every rival institution that once seemed equally permanent has dissolved into history. The Templars were burned. Their assets were seized. Their order was dissolved by a pope under pressure from a king who owed them money. They lasted less than 2 centuries. The Vatican financed the construction of the building where that pope issued his decree, and it is still there. The light in the vault beneath St. Peter does not flicker. It was upgraded to LED sometime in the early 2000s. The ledgers are electronic now. The compound interest still compounds.